Hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. I don't know if you knew it, but earlier this week, there was a very important meeting that took place, and it had everything to do with your tax dollars and how they are spent in Idaho. Now, if you weren't able to attend this meeting, in which a truly conservative budget for Idaho was presented, guess what? You have an opportunity to still see it in its entirety, to learn why it is the issue for the upcoming legislative season. And I'll tell you what, there are some pretty important things that have to happen if we want to see our money spent wisely by the lawmakers that we trust to do so. I've got details coming up.
All reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. You know, a couple of days ago at the Idaho State Capitol, the Idaho Freedom Foundation was there to help shed some light on the budget issue. And when I say the budget issue, actually, I think Idaho Freedom Foundation President Ron Nate had a better way of putting it. He says it's more of a budgeting issue than just simply, we got to knock out this one budget and it's one and done. So the Idaho Capitol Sun, I've got to give them credit. I think this was one of the most even-handed stories that I've seen them report, and they typically do a pretty good job here. Idaho Statesman, let's just say they were a little less complimentary in their coverage, but I want to share some excerpts from Idaho Capitol Sun's coverage, and then I want to invite you to check this out for yourself. In other words, don't take the sound bites, don't take what I'm saying or even what the legacy press is saying. Think this one through for yourself. So the headline, Conservative Idaho Group proposes $1.9 billion in state budget cuts, including Medicaid expansion. Now, that's a hot button issue for people who believe that it's government's job to not only take care of everybody, but make sure everybody is someone who needs to be taken care of. The foundation called on legislators to cut public school funding, not exclusively, by the way, but yes, that shouldn't be exempted from budget cuts like other state agencies, or like other state agencies were asked to make cuts earlier this year by the governor, but public education was exempted. And of course, they're looking at maybe cutting another $100.5 million from health and welfare. So let's break it down. Let's go through a few of the details here. And I'm not asking you to agree right up front. I just want you to understand that this is something that cannot go on indefinitely, because we have seen Idaho's budget bloat over the last few years. And a lot of that was due to COVID spending. The COVID dollars are no more, and we are in a real pickle if we don't change some spending and budgeting habits now. So here's how Idaho Capitol Sun put it. They said an influential conservative think tank is urging the Idaho legislature to cut Medicaid expansion, public school funding, and other programs to balance the state budget. Now, Idaho's projected to face between a $600 million and billion-dollar budget deficit in fiscal year 2027, which starts next July 1st. It's already facing a roughly $58 million deficit just in the current fiscal year. And you've probably heard a few things about this, from place to place. Well, leaders from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, a nonprofit organization that scores legislators based on their votes and frequently lobbies on bills, said Monday at the press conference at the Capitol building in Boise, the state's problems were self-inflicted. Now, I know legislators don't like to hear that, but let's put this where it is. It's not that some out-of-state group came in and said, you have to spend your money this way. It's how the legislators themselves and those charged with, appropriating that money chose to spend it. I love this quote from Idaho Freedom Foundation President Ron Nate. Idaho does not have a budget problem. We have a budgeting problem. So let's dive into that a little bit and see what that looks like. The organization known as IFF called for nearly $1.9 billion in cuts to the state budget next year, including state general funds, dedicated funds, and federal money. Now, Ron Nate emphasized that the problem wasn't from the several income tax cuts or rebates that were approved by the legislature in the last few years, which the Idaho Fiscal Policy Center estimates to have reduced total revenue by a total of $4 billion. Okay, so they took $4 billion less from the taxpayers. That's not the reason why we're in trouble, though. It's not we let people keep too much of their money, although you kind of get a little feel of that, don't you, the way that they word it? So the speakers on Monday blamed the deficit on increased spending amid the influx of federal pandemic relief funds since 2020. And let's not pretend. In 2020, yes, even though it was Trump, they were giving it away. Please, everybody take it. Trillions and trillions of dollars, which doesn't sound like much because we have such a hard time conceptualizing how much that is. But yeah, the federal government was just sending truckloads of money to the states. And in 2022, the state ended the fiscal year with a record $1.4 billion surplus. Okay, but it wasn't honestly earned surplus. And hey, look how much we saved on spending. It was because they were being, thrown buckets of money. Fred Birnbaum, IFF senior policy fellow, said revenue has continued to grow despite the tax cuts. See, you don't hear that much. And he said the state could support more cuts if it constrained its spending. But that if is the big wild card. Can we get legislators to constrain their spending? Well, we hope. So cutting Medicaid expansion was one of the central parts of IFF's budget proposal. And this sets off alarm bells for people who believe government is the answer to whatever problem, whatever question. Even if it hasn't been asked yet, government is the solution. Idaho voters in 2018 approved a ballot initiative to expand Medicaid eligibility to adults who earned too much to qualify for traditional Medicaid, but not enough for premium credits to afford private coverage through the state health insurance marketplace. So, gee, if we could just, find a way to use taxpayer monies to do this. The problem is it invites more people into a program that really was designed for the needy. And in fact, a lot of people end up on the program then who really aren't in the position of being needy, but just, hey, they see a good deal and they want to take it, not realizing that this one's being placed on the backs of the taxpayers. So as far as the Medicaid expansion, we found that there were numerous people who were on these roles who were able-bodied. In other words, they should have been able to work. And there have been multiple efforts in the legislature since that time to repeal the Medicaid expansion, which covered about 85,000 Idahoans as of November 14th. Now, this is last month they're talking about. Many of those who supported to repeal say the program is too expensive. Many of those who have opposed repeal say that uninsured people delaying care and ending up in emergency rooms would result in even higher costs, with previous funds to cover indigent care eliminated upon approval of Medicaid expansion. So we need to keep it, and we need to spend this money because something bad might happen. Okay, well, we got to do this just in case. It's the same reason I carry this rock around in my pocket. It's to keep bears away. Well, I don't see any bears around here. See, it must be working. It's the same kind of logic. Now, the group also called for an additional $100.5 million in cuts to Idaho Health and Welfare, about a 15% cut from the agency's prior year budget. Now, I'm not trying to throw stones here, figuratively or literally. I'm just saying Idaho Health and Welfare came to the table having overspent their budget here not so long ago, and just instead of justifying this is how we could either keep up the same level of spending or would justify more, so they just said we need more. No efforts at streamlining, no efforts at showing how we would use the money wisely. So it's time. And if you haven't looked at the DOGE cuts that were suggested earlier this summer by the Idaho Freedom Foundation, you'll see that these are not things of just stick a finger up in the wind and see what would the public accept. These are some very interesting areas that have abuse or redundancy that we don't need to be funding through taxpayer dollars. Now, IFF also called for a $166 million cut in Idaho public school spending, and this is where the pearl clutching kind of begins. Governor Brad Little in September called for state agencies nearly across the board to permanently cut their budgets by 3%. By the way, that is a stand-up move, and kudos to Brad Little or Governor Little for doing that. But he exempted K through 12 public schools. Why is that? I mean, clearly it's a sacred cow. But IFF leaders on Monday said the K through 12 budget should be held to the same cutbacks, and proposed a $166.5 million cut to the state's public school support package. Again, this causes great concern. You must be against, education. No, not at all. But there are alternatives, as you'll see here in just a moment. If we're really in a fiscal deficit, we should be cutting back across all agencies and programs. That's Brett Ferrugia, IFF policy analyst, and he says there should be no exemptions from any agency or program, especially unmerited ones. I mean, that logic is pretty tough to argue with. IFF also asked for the repeal of Idaho Launch. That's a $75 million grant program for graduating high school seniors that they can use toward university and college tuition or work training and apprenticeships from the in-demand fields. Now, These in-demand fields just happen to be industries that seem to comport very well with the Idaho, what is it, IACI, Idaho Coalition, I'm sorry, Commerce and Industry Association. I'm butchering their name, but bottom line is there were some real sweet deals for the well-connected businesses, which kind of makes you wonder if this wasn't a voucher of sorts for industry, courtesy of the governor and his allies in the legislature. Well, the IFF leaders didn't recommend cutting the $50 million private school choice tax credit, and they wonder about that. Well, it's brand new. It hasn't been tried yet, but this is actually giving people the opportunity to have school choice. It allows state money or taxpayer money that is passing through state hands to go to parents for private education, including private school tuition. I know that the state, we like to talk about like, well, this is sacred, it's its own entity, but it gets its money from the taxpayers. So let's not pretend that a tax credit, which allows taxpayers to keep more of that money in their pockets rather than give it to the state first and then beg for it back. It just makes more sense. It was never in the state's hands. It's just a credit toward their taxes. Are you with me? A handful of legislators did attend Monday's press conference, and ultimately, lawmakers and the state budget writers on the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, or JFAC, will decide how to balance the budget for next year. That legislative session starts on January 12th. Now, there's some time for you to get your mind around this before the legislative session starts, although next month is coming fast, as you have probably noticed. So here's my invitation to you. I would like you to go to idahofreedom.org. You'll notice that they have linked right at the top of the page as you land on their website. You can watch the video of the press conference, which was held earlier this week. It's only about 20 minutes long, maybe 21 minutes, worth your time, whether you agree or not. You really need to look at this because I want you to see that this is not just some ideological chanting, hey, hey, ho, ho, this budget crisis has to go. No. These are the facts and figures, and I'm talking the real charts and graphs and nitty-gritty, digging for the details that shows where these cuts could and should be taking place, and it would be worth your time to at least, examine it for yourself. These were a couple of things, too, that I thought needed to be mentioned before I close this out. Beyond simply cutting spending, this conservative budget for Idaho talks about the need for structural change. And by that, we mean banning off-budget spending and limiting continuous appropriations to make government spending comprehensively tracked and accessible. Also, stopping fund siphoning. In other words, don't divert sales tax revenue before it reaches the general fund. And finally, a lot of this can be solved by observing proper forms. In other words, restore legislative power. The budget process has to stop and end in the legislature as granted by the Constitution, which is that power of the purse. So there you have it, a conservative budget for Idaho. This is the chance to solve Idaho's budgeting problem. And whether you think you have a stake in it or not, I'm here to tell you, you do. It's your tax dollars. It's your government. And if you want to see your tax dollars used wisely, and if you want to see your government operating within its proper limits, it's an issue that you really should be diving into, and quickly, because the legislative session is coming up. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
All reporters are biased. The Idaho Press Club are biased. All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.